So you can tell where we're pretty useless. The next closed-circuit television was the Admiral's briefing system. Now, this system is interesting because it was designed by the gentleman who designed the EMI 2001 colour camera. And this, I'm sorry, you might think these are rather sexy, strange knobs, but it's actually the shadow of the knob here, and that's the knob. You have a camera looking down at the Admiral in his battleship's map table. And he is describing his plans for a battle. And that would save, one of the big problems in a fleet in the old days was getting the captains of all the ships onto the Admiral's battleship for him to brief them, particularly in bad weather. So they thought that if they had a television system that the Admiral could transmit to all his ships, that would be fine. As you can see, the equipment is basically a slightly different connectors of cables and everything, but basically I think you can see it's the same sort of equipment. Here's the waveform monitoring equipment, and I think that's the transmitter power control. They use the same monitoring equipment, and they use the same map table, which you can see it coming into use. Now, the final one to describe to you is the battlefield. I call it, because it's actually called Television Set 2 in EMI terms, but I call it the Army Battlefield Television System, because what they did, they took a super emitron camera on 2,000 feet of cable, which is a lot of cable, and they had an equivalent to a flight case by the camera. Excuse me, and what happened was all the signals, like Brian was talking about, frame scan, field scan, and that, were taken up to here. But after 2,000 feet of cable, they were a bit manky. So up here, they regenerated them and applied them to the camera. Back down here is the CCU, and here is the pulse generator, power supplies, and then it goes out to a transmitter and the same aerial. I haven't been able to find any photographs of the transmitting aerial. Now, this was a standard sort of British system, 405 lines interlaced, super emitron camera, optical viewfinder. Now, the camera had quite a selection of lenses, you will see. It had 1.5 and 2 inches for general purposes, 4 and 6 for medium distance work, and they all had large aperture. For telephoto work, they had a 12-inch between the transmitter and the aerial, 200 feet, which is quite, mad. Now, the camera was based on the studio super emitron. You always know a super emitron camera because it has a bulge coming out the right-hand side. And here is the super emitron tube, and it's called a super emitron because Lubzinski and Roeder in 1935 invented the image section, which is effectively a magnifier, and the gun comes out at an angle because they had to get this big coil system in. Here is a picture of the tube, the image section, the photocathode, which then focused the picture on the mosaic, which was then scanned in the usual way and picture. This tube was a minimum of 10 times as sensitive as the standard emitron. Could be higher, could be 12. And here is the glass work, and as you can see, it's quite a beast, and this is the image section. Just an interest, you all know about image orthicons. Image orthicons have 8 basic patents. What is interesting is of those 8 basic patents, 5 of them came out of EMI, 1 came out of the British government, and 2 came out of RCA, which is quite interesting. Here is the camera. This is the photograph I found in the museum. And here is the flight case with the camera cable coming in 2,000 feet, doing the job, and then providing the signals up to the camera. Here's the photograph of the camera head, but I'm going to change to this one. Now, this shows a 12-inch and a 6-inch lens mounted. You notice that the 12-inch lens has to have an extra piece of support. Here is the neck of the Super Emitron tube. But if they were using these lenses, the problem was the amount of light that was going through this lens to the ground glass screen, and if you were looking at a very long distance, the picture would be quite dim here on the ground glass screen. So they've installed a telescope. And what we believe happened was that the telescope was actually used for sighting the camera at an army or something miles and miles away, sort of thing. The 2,000 feet of cable the cable was carried on these drums with these novel loading cranes and onto these trolleys. These are actually the ones that they used in the first outside broadcast unit in the world, which was made for the coronation of King George VI in 1937. Here we have the CCU of the camera. Well, you've got the power supplies, you've got the pulse generators here, which have become modular into 4 units. Over here is the CCU. This time, the picture tube is mounted horizontally with a 45-degree mirror for the operator to see it. The receiving end, you've got the aerial, comes down into the receiver. It has a power supply, a display, and a remote display. Here is the standard aerial that they were using. Here you see the receiver with the picture monitor here for them to have a look at things. Power supply. Here it looks to me like about a 10 or 12-inch monitor, and here is the secondary monitor that could be used. I have found this Brown to Colonel Jones of the Royal Signal Regiment, Divisional Signals, and this says that they took, after demonstrations, the following day they took the transmitter to these 3 places and did trials, and they reckon they could get good images up to 12 miles away from the transmitter. I have converted coordinates to the coordinates that the Ordnance Survey uses now, and I've triangulated them to try and find out where the receiving point was, but it's not conclusive at the moment. I've got more work to do. Well, I've got to find the file of the trials, and that is ridiculously difficult. If you go to the Royal Signals and say, have you got any information on this battlefield television done in 1939? Because they were doing those trials. I don't know if you notice. Sorry. Yeah. They were doing these trials after the war started in 1939. And when I went to the Royal Signals Museum and mentioned closed circuit, we'll go away and look at it, and they came back and said the first set of equipment we had was in 1951. Germans, you know, it was absolutely crazy. The engineers that worked on those systems went on to make Airborne Intercept Radar Mark 4 work and Mark 6. This intercept radar, which was designed by TRE and didn't work, was in actual, well, it detected an aircraft when it was 300 feet from the aircraft that has got the kit in. So that's no good. You know, you're shot down before you know it's there. And the problem was that they couldn't produce a short enough pulse to send out. And Bloom, the short circuit delay line pulse generator, which became standard in a lot of circuitries. Also, EMI's engineers went on to do H2S and ASV, responsible for saving this in the latter part of the war, was responsible for saving the convoys in the Atlantic. Unfortunately, TRE's H2S system wasn't working very well, but the EMI one was. And one Sunday at 4:10 in the afternoon, Bloomline, Brown, went up in a Halifax bomber to try and sort out the TRE problems. They didn't have to, but they did, to try and help them. And the RAF technicians who had been maintaining the engines had completely misadjusted the tappets on the engines, and one after the other the engines caught fire, the plane caught fire, there were no parachutes, and they were all killed. And Churchill, in actual fact, put a D notice on the fact that Bloomline in particular had been killed, because he didn't want to give solace to the Germans that we'd lost our best electronics engineer. One thing that did come that I'm put in here, it's like television, it isn't television, but it's pictures, is EMI developed an infrared telescope or converter for seeing effectively in the dark. This is the little device. It's about 2 inches in diameter and about 2 inches deep, and this is the sort of picture you can see. Here is Brian Summers. And here it is, mounted on a headset. Now, you laugh, but you see there's a lens here onto those. It goes through a mirror system so that the guy can see where he's going. He did actually have mounted on his head a infrared lamp source, and also one on each ankle. And this was particularly developed because in preparation for many seaborne landings, they wanted to know the depth and the type of sand and shingle that were on the beaches, because they wanted to know whether they could take the weight of the tanks and the armoured cars and that. So what used to happen is a submarine used to go off the coast, and a couple of guys would get into a rubber dinghy, row ashore with all their tubes put down in the sand and everything, do all their measurements and everything, and then of course they had to find the dinghy, and they found the dinghy with the infrared lamps and everything, got back in and rowed back to the submarine. There's a postscript that I found, and this is very interesting. This, you can see, is August 1948. And there's a gentleman who is the director of the Royal Artillery at Aldershot. He had found out that the defence weapons and vehicle department of the army were playing around with closed-circuit television. And this guy writes to these people saying, do you know we did all this in 1939? And he puts in the reasons why, and he says, I don't think you'll find it very useful, sort of thing. And this guy makes the excuse, I've read the file about this, so he's making an excuse, I can tell you, that his project was not directly concerned with television. It was actually a Pi Photicon channel that they put in a vehicle to see what they could do. But that is the postscript to the thing. So the channels I've been talking to you about predate things by at least 10 years. I'd like to thank these people for their help in the preparation of this lecture, half years of research, and also I'd like to thank Brian Clough and Ray Knight for their expertise in computer graphics. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Norman. Absolutely fascinating, I think. Any questions? Anything in particular anybody's interested in? No, Graham.
Well, I think if the plane was flying around a place, you need something that was omnidirectional, really. And I think that was the reason. I haven't been able to find any details of the transmitting aerial, and I would suggest that they were probably, for the battlefield television, using something similar to what they were using in the outside broadcast units at that time for the BBC. What they used in the plane, I haven't got a clue. I haven't been able to find a photograph or anything about it. Sorry.
Yeah, really interesting. And of course, interesting it's 50 megs because there's a demo outside of 51.2 megahertz. And as I pointed out to Peter, actually the 12 miles that they achieved in the Army trials is further than Dave Mann's achieved yet on his digital system. But we have only been doing it for about a week and a half, so yeah. But no, absolutely fascinating. A great way to finish the day. Thank you very much. Hopefully you found today interesting so far. That was